Let me welcome James Williams, the dean here, and I want to welcome everyone to what is sort of the last GSSW lecture of this annual year. We're really pleased that we were able to tap one of our local gems so I'm really proud and pleasure to introduce Dr. Barry Hughes. I've been here at the university for 9 years. He's been here a lot longer, and I've heard of him, but I've never had an opportunity to see him present some of his work until we had an opportunity to work together with him a couple of years ago in Switzerland. And I had to sit and hear him, and then I was hooked. And I said, you have to really come and present at our school to talk about the work you're doing. So Dr. Hughes is a graduate of Stanford and also the University of Minnesota. He has been a professor here at the Korbel School in the University of Denver for double-digit years. And is also a John Evans Professor, which is one of the highest accomplishments that the university awards to some of our leading scholars on the campus. He's consulted with the governments of Germany and Iran and Egypt, as well as the U.S. He seems to travel more than I do, and I'm sure my colleagues would say that I'm on the road quite a bit. He's published extensively. His work is I find it very engaging. The computer models that he's been working on, simulation to look at sort of international futures, and looking at studies of issues related to students and policymakers. And I think for us in the area of social science and social work, when I saw his work, I thought, wow, this has got wonderful application to the work that we do, and it would have been a wonderful opportunity to expose him to our faculty and staff. So let me welcome my colleagues from just across the campus, as we refer here up the hill, at the Korbel School, Dr. Barry Hughes.
Williams, thank you very, very much for that, and I am so glad that you did take that opportunity to invite me. It was awfully nice. I enjoyed the dinner last night. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. The official title of this is The Future of Global Human Development, and we're going to be talking about a considerable variety of things today. We're going to be looking at a number of global transformations, a number of global transitions, and I hope all of you can see one of these two screens. I'm going to maybe wander a little bit here so I can see the screen better myself. I don't like being behind the podium. I'd rather be out closer to you if I can be. But what we're going to talk about here is the changing of the world in the 21st century. And we're going to be looking across a good chunk of the 21st century. I decided to do that because many of you are, in fact, going to be pursuing your careers, pursuing your lives through much, and I would guess in a few cases in this room, all of the 21st century. So I think it's appropriate for us to look at that. And at the same time, as we're talking about forecasts, as I'm trying to tell you some of the things that we think might happen, I want to tell you how careful we are not to talk about making predictions. We don't know, obviously, anything about what the future really is going to be like. If you were at the beginning of the 20th century and you were talking about going into and through much of the century, you would have gotten so incredibly many things wrong. So let's be humble about forecasting, and I put a couple things up there. One of the ones I like the best, actually, is right there in the middle, Decca Recording, which is a pretty good outfit, at least has been. And in 1962, they said to the Beatles, no thank you. We don't like your sound. Guitar music is going out. Then there are all kinds of forecasts like this that have been just a tad off the mark, including Ken Olsen, the founder of DEC. There's no reason for anybody to want a computer in their household. How many computers do you people have in your households now? I can't even count the number that we have in ours. So we're going to talk about transformation, global transformation. And I want to talk about three different general categories of transformation. The one is most purely the human development, the capacity of people, capacity of ourselves. Things like education and our health, our longevity, which obviously links also to our aging. Social development, which is closely linked to that, and among the issues there in terms of our relationship with each other, our distributional issues within society, power aspects within society, and obviously issues around stability, conflict, and governance capacity within society. The third category of things that we tend to forecast in my Pardee Center, and the third set of things we generally focus on are the biophysical development issues, the issues around environment and technology, and the mastery of technologies, but also the disruptive impacts they have, as well as our relationship with our biophysical environment and whether we can have a sustainable relationship with it. These are the things that we deal with, and all of these link to human development. I'm going to focus primarily on some of the earlier ones, but I don't think we can talk about human development going forward in this century without talking a little bit about all of these things. The International Futures Forecasting System, which is the primary tool we use in the Pardee Center at the Korbel School, has these various models within it. This is not about modeling. This is not a talk about what we do in modeling, but all of these things relate to what I just said. The green elements here are human development. The red elements are the social development, and the blue elements are the relationship with the biophysical environment. These are the kinds of things we represent, and almost all of the forecasts I showed you today are going to be from that modeling system. Let's start with the basics. If we're talking about human development, the most basic thing is how many of us are there? And this is a graphic that you've seen parts or all of before. This takes us from 1950 actually through the end of the century. For the first 50 years there it is data, and then it is forecast from three different sources. One is the United Nations, the green line on top. One of them is a group in Austria called the IASA, International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, the blue line coming down, and the red line in the middle is our own forecasts. This graphic, you've seen it, but it's got some very interesting things in this very simple presentation. Between 1945, the end of World War II, and this year, global population went from 2.35 billion to 7.3 billion. We tripled the world population in 70 years. We added 5 billion people to the world's population in the last 70 years. And there are a number of us here who age takes us back to that period. So we have lived through 5 billion additional people being added to the population. Now let's think about what's going to happen in the next 70 years, between now and 2085, based upon these forecasts. We're going to go up to someplace just short probably of 10 billion people, which means we're going to be adding another 2.7 billion people someplace in there. About half as many as we added in the last 70 years. This is a significant change in the pattern of demographic growth. I saw just out in the lobby here a forecast of population, global population on the wall, and it's going up in the exponential fashion, which was in fact the case until fairly recently as the curve began to bend and we began to see some slowing down. The peak of global growth rates in population was in the late 1960s at 2%. It's now down to about 1.1% a year, and we are moving slowly towards some kind of stability in population. This has dramatic consequences for all of us. Before I go into some of the consequences, look at this. This is one of the key drivers of that, obviously. This is the total fertility rate, and it's the total fertility rate, meaning the number of children that a woman will have typically in her lifetime. I've divided it here into 4 segments of the world population and world society. The bottom line there are the high-income countries like the United States. The next line, the red boxes coming down, those are upper middle income countries, and China is in that category and accounts for a significant portion of that drop. The next category are the lower middle income countries. If you think China for the red, upper middle, think India for the lower middle. And the top line are the low income countries, think Nigeria, Bangladesh. And between 1960 and 2010, all of those lines have been coming down fairly significantly. And the path that they're on, obviously, is continued decrease. One of the key issues as we go into this century further will be, in fact, how low will those total fertility rates go, and will some of the countries that are down in the 1.5 range or below actually begin to see rising fertility rates? In terms of the global population, the age structure is changing dramatically as a result of this. The green line there is the portion of the global population which is 15 years and younger. And many people in this room and in this school obviously have careers that are oriented towards the child and child development. And on a global basis, those numbers are coming down and will be coming down as a percentage of the total fairly steeply. The more aged population, 65 and above, is undergoing a dramatic change upward globally, not just in the United States, and those lines will cross sometime close to the middle of the century. This is the United States, and there the youth line is coming down. The aging line is going up even more rapidly. That's the baby boomers. And between now and 2030, there's a steep increase before it begins to level off. So those lines will actually cross sometime around 2025. So in terms, again, of the interest of people in this school, whether you're focused on the youth or the elderly, this is going to affect your careers going forward, and just in terms of the demands and pressures upon social work and upon all of us. Let's move from population to start talking a little bit about education. And this is one of my favorite graphics, actually. It's very simple, but it represents something that I think is fundamentally important and underestimated. Once again, we've got on a global basis here, we've got the total fertility rate, coming down substantially over time. The green line is new on this graphic, and that is the average years of education, formal education, that women 15 years of age and older have. In 1960, the average woman in the world only had 3 years of education, formal education. We are now up to, what does that graphic say? In 2015, we're up to about 7 years of education, and that trend is sharply upward. Those two lines suggest to me a major global transformation with respect to the role of women and the nature of society. Fundamentally important global transformation. And one of the things that's interesting is they cross at about 4 years of education, 4 children per woman. And I actually call that the global law of female role transition, because that happens in almost all the countries we see. I'm going to show you a couple more. This is the United States. Unfortunately, our data don't go back beyond 1960. I haven't been able to find data on female education back earlier than that. But my guess is that this goes back, and those cross over someplace probably in the late 30s or 40s. That's kind of a Rosie the Riveter a kind of transformation going on in American society. And we are now at almost 10 years of female education, and obviously down very low. Actually more than 10 years of female education. We're up in the neighborhood now of 12 years of female education, formal education on average. As many of you know, there are more females in the United States in universities than there are males. The balance has shifted, not just in DU, but elsewhere. This is Iran. And I enjoyed looking at this one because most people here would not have been able to draw this diagram and would not have anticipated that it would look like this. This diagram says that the fertility rate in Iran took a big drop starting in the 1980s from about 6 children per woman down to where it is now, which is closer to 2 children per woman. The Ayatollahs actually have overseen a major transformation in fertility rates in Iran. At the same time, the education of women has gone up from practically nothing back in 1960 in terms of formal years of education, up to now we're in the neighborhood of 6 years or 7 years and rising. Now, this is something that I believe, and I haven't had a chance to really explore this internationally yet, but I believe that this transformation precedes by about 20 to 30 years, about one generation, 1.5 generations, precedes some significant social transformations in society. Things that were happening in our country in the 1960s in terms of women's liberation, role transformation, I think reflected to some degree those changes in fertility and education patterns that were taking place in that crossover 20, 30 years earlier. And I've been saying for some time that I think the Iranian society, that crossover was in 1970, what was it up there? Roughly 1980, I can't read it from here. Actually closer to 1990, right? So right now, 25 years ago. And I have been saying at a generation, generation and a half, maybe two at the most, and you have major social transformations that you can see in terms of the pressure of elements in society for major transformations, including democratization. And I think we see that in many societies around the world. I'd like to be able to actually explore this in much more detail. The Chinese transformation took place in 1976. Tiananmen Square, 1988. It hasn't finished by any means a transformation, but that was a significant step towards the transformations that are happening there. Interestingly, Saudi Arabia, 1995. They still can't drive without a male brother, husband, whatever, but that is changing, actually, beginning to change in very small ways, and I suspect that we're going to see some significant changes there also. Syria 2000, India 2000, Africa 2010. So that transformation is something to keep an eye on. This is looking now at the education and age structure combined. The world in 2010 on the left, the red, you know the age categories, age cohorts up the left-hand side. The red are people who have not completed primary education. They might have had a year or two, but they haven't completed it. And there are more women on the right side of that middle than there are men on the left side who have not completed primary education. The green is completed primary education, but not further. The yellow is secondary. The blue is tertiary. So that's the shape of the global age distribution in 2010 and of our education distribution. Now that is going to change, and it's going to change quite dramatically as we go through this century. The blue on the right is a wild guess at the way it might look at the end of the century, and you might look at that and say, no way will the world look like that with that much secondary and tertiary education. But look at the US right now. The U.S. right now has a pattern that is not so terribly different from that one that we're looking at the end of the century over here. The U.S., the U.S. has a baby boom, obviously, the period, the people there in the 50s and 60s. We've now got something like 8,000 people retiring every year in the United States. Every year, every day. 8,000 people retiring every day in the United States. And that's the baby boom, and you see the baby boom echo, but you see that advance of education there, and something like that for the world may not be impossible. But I'll tell you what, I don't believe it. And I don't believe it, I'm going to say I don't believe it not because I think the world is not capable of that kind of human capital advance. I think it's because I'm not even sure we're going to have those same categories of education as we go further into the century, much less by the end of it. Technological disruptions, which we maybe can try to get to a little bit later here. Technological disruptions are beginning not just to work in manufacturing and low-level services, but the professions, including educators, are going to be subject to these in dramatic ways, obviously. And the way education is going to be shaping people throughout their childhood and through the rest of their lives is going to change so dramatically. It reminds me of the New Yorker cartoon that most of you have seen, where the dog is sitting at the computer terminal and saying to the dog next to them, "The great thing about the internet is nobody knows you're a dog." The great thing about upper education and tertiary education in 20 or 30 years may be nobody knows you're an 8-year-old versus a 15-year-old. So the process of going through these stages is almost certainly going to change in some dramatic way. We are increasingly turning our attention, obviously from basic education, the Millennium Development Goal of 2015, to secondary education and so on, but we're going to be increasingly turning our attention everywhere in the world to the quality of it. And this is a graphic that uses World Economic Forum scale of education, with higher there being less good and lower numbers being better. The axis around, the x-axis along the horizon there is GDP per capita, and you can see where different countries are placed. The bluish, light bluish dots are the high-income countries, Western Europe, North America. The yellowish dots are Latin American countries, indicating Peru up there. They tend to be above the line, which would indicate to me that their education quality is less good on average, according to the measurements or estimates of the WEF, than we would expect given their income level. As that income level advances left to right, in general, quality advances down that index. And we see that some countries are way above what we would expect. Tunisia. Look at Tunisia, and I don't think this is unrelated to the democratization process and relative success there. They have been indicated to have a considerably higher quality of education than we would have expected at their level of GDP per capita. In contrast, I've already mentioned Peru, but we have Italy as well. I don't know if I trust all these estimates very well. Andreas is already wanting to raise a question. Why not? Go for it, please.
I'm just curious, what is the outlier country on the far right?
On the far right. Let's see, who is the highest income country in the world right now? Luxembourg is high, but not that high, I think. We'll check it out. We'll check it out on a computer once we get further along here. I'm going to shift gears now from education to health. And this is a graphic which does not come from our forecasts, but it's also a graphic that I think is quite amazing. This shows from 1840 to the year 2000, the life expectancy of women in the country of the world with the highest life expectancy at the time. So in the mid-1800s over there, those were primarily Scandinavian countries. As the time goes on and the line keeps growing, but on the upper right there, that's Japan, Japanese women with the highest life expectancy. The thing that amazes me about that graphic is its linearity. I would never have expected that year after year, decade after decade, we'd be adding about 2.4 years of life expectancy per decade to the longest lived women in the world. And this, of course, is a major matter of debate among demographers and among health specialists in terms of what's going to happen now. The population forecast that I showed you earlier on the very first graphic from the UN, from YASA, from us, are all assuming that that curve will bend. And that by 2100, we're probably going to be around 90 to 92 in terms of female life expectancy. But there are people out there increasingly who are saying medical breakthroughs are not necessarily going to end with communicable disease reduction, that they will progress also through chronic disease reduction, and that will continue to increase, which makes a difference in population forecast, but not a dramatic one. Fertility rates primarily shape that. Yeah, Libby.
I remember reading somewhere around 2010 that Japan spent 1/5 of what the United States does on health care.
In terms of the percentage of GDP directed towards healthcare, if we had that on a graph, we would be the big outlier. There's nobody around the world, I think, that probably spends close to, what is it now, 15, 16, I can't keep up with the numbers of percentage of GDP that we spend on healthcare. And Japan, it might be a fourth, it might be a half, but it's dramatically lower. Yeah. These are the global deaths by major WHO health category. The blue line is our deaths from non-communicable disease. The green line are the deaths from communicable disease. Over many decades, we have been fighting communicable disease, and obviously with tremendous success. That's what largely pushed up those life expectancies. And you can see how much lower already. I bet you that's probably, again, surprises quite a number of people here. You wouldn't have expected the communicable disease deaths to be that much lower than the chronic disease deaths, but they're dramatically lower, and they're diverging in a significant way. The red line are accidents and injuries. That's the third major category that WHO rolls up its detailed numbers into. Now, one of the reasons that you might be surprised by that is the next graph, which focuses on years of life lost. The people who die of communicable disease tend to be children or people of younger ages. And if you count the number of years lost every time one dies relative to the number of years of life they might have had, if they were the longest-lived Japanese women that we were talking about. You take all those years and you add it up across all the people who die of communicable disease, and you do the same thing of all the people who die of chronic disease, and here the picture looks quite different. They're almost identical at this point, although, again, the lines are spreading, and in a very short time, right about now actually, we're moving into a world in which the years of life lost are also predominantly due to chronic diseases rather than communicable. This is a dramatic shift of things. The red line is one thing I think we should pay attention to because, again, these are years of life lost to accidents and injuries. Right now, the estimate is every year we're losing, well, these are deaths now. I'll go back from years of life lost to death. But we have 1.5 million deaths around the world from auto accidents. We have now brought malarial deaths down from about 1 million to someplace around 500 to 600,000 in recent years. That's on a nice downturn. We don't know if it'll last, but it's going down. HIV deaths are about 1 million and also on a downturn. We're losing as many or more people to auto accidents as we are to those diseases. And the auto accident deaths are going up. Some of the best forecasts that are out there right now suggest that we might have 3.1 million by 2050. So that's an epidemic we don't often talk about, but it's an epidemic as real as any communicable disease epidemic. I have to say I don't necessarily believe this one either. I think Google and a number of the other companies working on this, Tesla, I can hardly wait for self-driven cars. I think that aged population that we were looking at earlier, some of us are going to need those self-driven cars, and the sooner the better. It's going to make a big difference for those of you in social work, obviously, in terms of the mobility and the potential of the people you're taking care of in that age category. And I think we're going to solve a lot of that problem with the deaths by such mechanisms. That is going to be hard to spread in the short term, however, beyond the high-income countries. So this is a very big uncertainty right now. Benchmarking, again, infant mortality. I think I'm going to skip over this because it basically shows, again, some countries above what you would expect based upon their income level, some countries below. I can't quite figure out why the countries below infant mortality expectations, namely the yellow countries, the yellow dots, the Latin American countries, are below on expected infant mortality. That's better than you would expect, when they're worse than you would expect on education. Maybe somebody who's a Latin American expert can explain that to me, but I'm still kind of trying to figure that one out. Another epidemic, obesity, and I picked on Latin America here again, but this is Central Caribbean countries, Central America, South America, and it's the years 2010 through 2030. Those rates are not only extremely high already, but they're obviously in an upswing, and that's not so different from elsewhere around the world. We're talking about huge obesity epidemic. Now, I'm going to bridge more concretely from the human development to the social development. We've been talking about things that affect social development quite dramatically, but I want to focus more on that. We read all the time about the growing global middle class, so I thought you might like to see some numbers. The values in 2010, well actually 2015, on a global basis are around 1.4 billion people. Now, when you see a number like that, if you're keeping your wits about you, you have to say, what the devil are they talking about? What does middle class mean? Because when we're talking about the global middle class, is it the same to be middle class in Kenya or Tanzania as it is to be middle class in Germany or the United States? I kind of don't think so. But the middle class numbers that are generally used are $10 to $50 a day when we're looking globally. And that $10 to $50 a day is picked roughly because $10 is about the average income in Brazil per day, and $50 is closer to that of Italy per day. So people picked those numbers and said, let's use them. We used them to come up with this 1.4 billion calculation. But with those numbers, we'll have more like 3.4 billion in 2050, growing much, much faster than the global population is at this point. We're going to be adding 2 billion people in the next 35 years to the global middle class using that particular definition. And there you can see, looking at, again, the pinkish line being the high-income countries like the United States, the reddish line being the upper middle-income countries like China. You can see where a lot of that growth is occurring initially. And then you can see a little bit further out how the lower middle-income countries will be moving into that area, India again, and so on. Now, a lot of us are concerned very, very substantially, and in this room I know it's going to be true, with distributional issues, not just with how many people in that middle class, but how things are distributed. These are from what have we got there? About 1960 again, I hope? No, it's about 1980. I can't tell the first year of that. I'm sorry, it's my graphic, but I can't tell you what that first year is. Anyway, they're smoothed averages across those same 4 income categories of something called the Gini coefficient. My guess is almost everybody here knows what the Gini coefficient is. It's a measure of income distribution, and higher numbers mean more unequal. So those upward sloping lines across all 4 of those income categories, global income categories, are indicative of within country increases in maldistribution, inequality. And that, of course, for those of you who have read Piketty's book, actually probably almost nobody has read Piketty's book, but who have skimmed parts of it or read about it. What is it? How many pages, Andreas? 700 or 800 anyway.
It's more than 800.
Okay, yeah. You might be one person who has read it. At any rate, the upward tendency there is something that he talked about, although he was focused more on wealth than on income. And it's much harder to get data on wealth than it is on income, and the inequality is much larger. Now that graphic is really important. It's really important to all of us in this room. But I want to show you another one which is perhaps a little less known by you. This now takes all the people in the world by countries of the rich, that's the OECD, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development countries. Countries that are poorer, those are the rest of the world basically, and looks at the average income in the richer countries as a ratio to the average income in the poorer countries. Now, economic historians tell us that in 1800, roughly, the Europeans were on average about twice as wealthy as the rest of the world in terms of income per capita, a factor of 2. That gap, that divergence grew over 180, almost 200 years, and it reached a peak of about 14. It is now, for the last 25 years been coming down. Now, a significant part of that is China's economic growth, because these are population-weighted numbers here. They're not just the country-weighted, but this is looking at population around the world. And that ratio has already fallen down into a number that I bet you almost nobody here knew, around 8, and is on a downward tendency. Now, it isn't just China. It's been significantly China going back there, but it's also India, where growth rates are now pretty consistently above 6%. They're striving for 8%. They want more, but the rates have been going up. It's a lot of the other upper middle income countries and lower middle income countries. And that decrease in global inequality, I would argue, is something that we should look at least as much as we look at the distribution within societies. They're not unrelated. There are some dynamics around trade and job locations and so on that link those two things together. But let's not forget that they're both happening. The wealth is something we have a hard time getting our hands on. These are numbers from Credit Suisse. And Credit Suisse says that particularly in the non-OECD countries, this is a very short horizon, 2000 to 2015. I can't find wealth numbers for countries around the world. Piketty was focused almost entirely on a small number of European countries because he could get it from estate data. When people died, he was able to get numbers that indicated the wealth within those countries. But there are relatively few countries that have that kind of database, so wealth is hard to get hold of. We know, however, that wealth is becoming also within countries, which is what this is showing, more unequally distributed, and is actually the bigger problem than income. Poverty reduction. Not only is this gap between the global rich and the global poor coming down quite dramatically, and the number of people who are poor within countries is coming down. We may have lousy distributional issues, they may be getting worse, but we have been making a great deal of progress against poverty. These are the percentages of people living on less than $2 a day. You know, what's sometimes called the absolute poverty level, $1.25, about to be shifted upward with the change of accounting systems globally. You know that number, but $2 is often referred to as extreme poverty. And in 1990 and we don't have data that go back, unfortunately, much before 1990, which is about the beginning of the Millennium Development Goal period, 1990 to 2015. In 1990, the low-income countries, 90% of people, roughly, were living on less than $2 a day. That has been coming down dramatically by 2010, 2015, and we have every reason to believe that those numbers will continue to drop. Mike?
Can you relate that to the United States
Alone, we've got practically nobody living on $2 a day or less. Yeah, I mean the bottom line down there near the axis are the high-income countries. Our poverty numbers that we talk about in the press all the time are related to a much higher poverty level. And in most high-income countries, the poverty levels are computed as a fraction of the median income level. And so as the median income level goes up, the poverty level also goes up, which is one of the reasons it's darn difficult to reduce poverty. And if you've got growing inequality, you're not going to reduce it. If you had constant inequality, in fact, the poverty level would not go down because we keep adjusting it over time to go up with the average income level. It's very difficult. This poverty calculation thing in high-income countries is really messy. I'm going to switch gears quite substantially. We're still in the social transformation area, but this is a graphic of something that in social work you probably talk about a lot less than we do in Korbel School, which is national power. And national power is extremely difficult to measure. We generally do it in terms of looking at demographic size, economic size and capability, military size and capability, and we come up with indices. If you apply those indices to countries around the world, you see that the U.S. from 1960 up until fairly recently has been running in the 20 to 25% of all global power. That's largely because of how incredibly much we spend on the military, although it's also related, obviously, to our economic size. We only have, what is it now, 5%, it's probably decreasing, maybe less than 5% of the world's population. So it obviously isn't coming from demographics. China's power is rising sharply by these same measures. And someplace around 2030, give or take 5 years, depending on which measure you use of power, they're almost certainly going to pass us. They already have in terms of GDP total, as of and measured at purchasing power parity as of this last year, and they're on their way to pass us on all kinds of things. There will be a period between 2030 and later in the century where China's power by almost all of these measures is predominant. And at that point, India, which will keep climbing throughout this century, might well catch up with and even pass China. Certainly will in terms of population. It will pass China's population sometime in the first half of this century and will continue to grow economically. Benchmarking again, and this is related to the one I just showed you. Education years along the y-axis, the x-axis there, and along the y-axis is a measure of democracy from a project called Polity. It's a scale from lower democracy to higher, from 0 to 10. And the line through the middle is the normal pattern, so to speak, of increasing democracy with increasing education. One of the things that we're looking at over a team over in the Pardee Center is what we refer to as structural imbalances in the development process. And a structural imbalance, we would argue, could arise if you have a society with a high level of income and a low level of democracy. Theoretically, it could arise also if you have a society with a low level of education and a high level of democracy. But I want to draw your attention to some of the countries that are below the line there that would seem to have a structural imbalance in terms of too little democracy given their levels of education. At the high levels of education, I put Ukraine and Russia in so you could see where those are. But look down really near the x-axis. You've got countries like Syria, Morocco, Tunisia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. We were looking at this back at the end of the 2010, the end of the 2000s decade, before 2010, and arguing that this kind of discrepancy was an invitation for instability and major transformation within societies. We didn't say there was going to be an Arab Spring in 2011? But we were saying that something like that was always a potential for that kind of country. And we see that, in fact, there are quite a few countries that are still very, very vulnerable to that structural imbalance. I don't like the phrase that you sometimes read in the international political literature called premature democratization. I mean, democratization, many of us like enough to think it really, in a way, should never be premature in a society. But according to this figure, look at some of the countries that are having more democracy than you would expect. Niger, Mozambique, Burundi. These are some countries that have, mostly in Africa, more democracy than you would expect. And there is, I think, to be argued, a potential for political and social instability associated with that also. Now, I'd like to move on from social development to biophysical development, but I'm going to do a status check here. We're 10 minutes before noon, and this I know many of you have to leave, or some of you at least have to leave right about noon. And I haven't given any chance for Q&A, really. I'd like to show you a few more graphics in this third section, but I want to check with you. Dean, what shall I do here?
Well, I have a question. Can I ask a question? And it had to do with you're looking at sort of it was the poverty, the $2 a day and the okay. So even though those graphs are coming and they're narrowing, population is also growing. So you said there's going to be an extra 2.5 billion people on this planet. So does that, even though you have that narrowing, are those numbers narrowing, or will the numbers be actually the same, even though we've gotten closer together
Yeah.
because of the increase in population?
Okay, so the question is whether, even though the percentages in poverty are coming down in those 4 income categories I showed you and are forecast to come down, given growing populations, particularly at the lower income levels, will the actual numbers in poverty also come down? And the answer is yes. That's been happening. And it's in almost all forecasts, including ours, is going to continue to happen. Obviously not quite as slowly for the exact reasons you raised. But right now, the Sustainable Development Goals, which many of you are familiar with, which are just being formalized, finalized, released, are actually calling for what they say is the eradication of extreme poverty by 2030. Now, eradication, they're leaving a little cushion, 3%. I mean, even in the United States, we have some people who are living on less than $2 a day. It might be small, but there are some. So 3% is the target. We have done a number of analyses of that target. Significant numbers of countries will reach it. We think that there are, however, a substantial number of countries in 2 kind of overlapping groupings that won't reach it. In Africa and in what are called conflict-afflicted states, fragile states. In both of those groupings, large numbers of countries won't reach it, particularly in that conflict-afflicted set. And we've done analyses of how many that is, where they are. But yes, they won't reach the 3%, and they'll still have a lot of people in poverty. We're coming down, though, from, and again, Andreas would probably know these numbers better than I do, but probably from from close to 1 billion people in poverty by current poverty level estimates. Give or take 100 million, one direction or another. About 1 billion people living on $1.25 a day or less at $2,005. And that number is almost certainly going to drop to 300 million or fewer by 2030.
So the answer to your question was, if people have questions, maybe next time.
Take a question break now, and then if anybody wants to stay, we'll take a few more graphics after that. Are there other questions at this point? Wide open. I know I've covered an awful lot of things pretty thinly. Andreas.
To me, the big unknown in all this benchmarking is China. And speak up, okay. The unknown to me is China, the big unknown in all the benchmarking, basically, because I mean, you can see how low China ranks.
Right.
Almost the lowest ranking country here.
Right.
And I think there is a lot of, I'm a fascinated observer of what's going on in China right now. And there's a lot of people who think that we will see probably not an Arab Spring movement in China, but some significant decline of the political system and its power capabilities within the next 15 years. Now, if that happens, it will mess up all the forecasting, right?
Yes, it really could. I mean, this graphic and the one just before it, in my mind, go together in terms of trying to tease out what you're talking about. Because, if China is going to become the biggest power in the world in about 20 years, how democratic and how politically, socially stable are they going to be? Now, we know that right now, they're clear down here, a big democratic deficit. There are pressures, as you just suggested, for changing that internally. Tiananmen Square was a very early harbinger, but all the protests going around locally around environmental issues and seizures of properties by local communities for development purposes and for the elite within those communities, whether the Communist Party or economic elites. These things are really causing great disruptions. There are thousands of protests that are officially reported even. What's going to happen here? One of the things that to add to what you've said, one of the things that worries a lot of us looking at this is this middle range of democratization between maybe 3 and 7 or 8 is considered an unstable range. that it's a transitional location between being authoritarian and potentially quite stable, like China is for the most part right now, and a number of other very authoritarian states are, and being democratic and peacefully and happily so. But in between, you've got a lot of potential for unrest. And if China begins to move up here in the next 20 or 30 years and is in between at the same time that it passes this power threshold level, that's worrisome. And it's one of the things that I think in terms of global politics, international politics, is one that everybody in the US government who deals with security is concerned about. Other questions, comments? Please.
In the case of China, there's a disconnect between their political system and their economic, which is increasingly free enterprise and capitalistic. So I think that might be part of this discrepancy.
Yeah, the point is there's a discrepancy or discontinuity between the economic system and the political system. And the economic system has become increasingly free market and continues to move in that direction. And the political system obviously hasn't represented that. The societies we're used to thinking about, Western Europe, North America, Japan, have a much greater linkage between those two elements. And it's a bit hard to know the degree to which you can maintain that discrepancy. Singapore is often put forward as an example where you have a quite authoritarian system, although not a Chinese level authoritarian, and you have totally, well, actually nobody's totally free economically, but highly free economically, highly market oriented. And Singapore maintains it, but it's a city-state. And China is 1.4 billion, well, 1.3 billion people going on 1.4 billion. Yes, please.
How do you decide what democratic is? You know, like I'm thinking about Bernie Sanders and the election and the idea that what's really going on here in the U.S., I mean, is it a democracy or do you see what I mean? Like, what are the factors that determine this freedom?
That's a really good question, and we all pretty much in this room are social scientists, and we all know how difficult it is to build indices of almost anything. You make a lot of choices which are questionable. There are several different measures of democratization. The one that I showed you here, polity, is one of the more widely used. The Freedom House has its measure of freedom, which is to some degree related to democratization, and they divide it into economic and civil political. I'm going to get this wrong. Help me out. We got political and civil, basically, sub-indices of freedom. The polity index looks heavily at the executive turnover and the patterns of executive turnover. Is there regularized turnover? Is it competitive? Is it non-authoritarian? I mean, an election in Belarus where a relatively standard election that the Europeans have now blessed with relief of some sanctions, re-elected a dictator, would not show up as a high level of democratization in that measure. It would show up as quite low. And there are other elements. It's not just executive turnover, but that's a key element in that polity measure. Joan.
Are you doing anything in the area of immigration, the movement of people?
I knew that question was going to come up in one form or another. I mean, how could it not? The question is, are we doing anything around immigration, movement of people? And the answer is, in terms of forecasting, no. If you look at historic patterns of migration, they are so irregular and so subject to surges that it's a very, very difficult thing for anybody to forecast, particularly in the longer term kinds of forecasts that we do. What we have done actually in our model, we don't ignore migration. Our demographic representations include migration into and out of countries. We have gone to that organization outside of Vienna called IASA, and we have taken their forecasts. They were bold enough to do it. We have actually built them into our forecasting system as one of the very few exogenous things that we have in there. Almost everything else we do, we build endogenously as a result of other variables changing values. That one we have taken from them and built in. I don't believe they're immigration forecasts particularly, but they're as good as any that we've got. Now, part of your question probably would be not just the numbers of migration, but the impact of it in society. And that's also a very difficult thing to forecast. We have tried to represent in our own forecasting the typical kind of age structure and gender structure of many migration patterns, so that we have some, we're not assuming that the people coming in, the families or individuals coming in are exactly the same as the people who are in the accepting population. So there is a change that will affect age structure, and it will also therefore affect labor force size and economic growth. But that's only, again, one small part of the impact. The big one, the social impact, what the Germans are struggling with right now, with the migrants coming up from through Turkey and elsewhere into the Balkans and Hungary, Austria, into Germany, 700, 800 million this year perhaps. There is no way for us to really understand and think about how to forecast the impact of that. We know that there are going to be, I mean, everybody here knows there are going to be social problems. The Pegida demonstrations just in the last week or so have intensified. The opposition to the migrants is certainly going to flare up. We know that. Merkel will do her best to fulfill the promises she's made, and I think is remarkable in having made them, and huge numbers of Germans are widely accepting of that. And I'm talking about Germans here not just because of Andreas, but because Germany stands out in Europe on this one, right? Germany has stepped up to the plate in ways that other countries have not. So the answer is basically no. Andreas.
If I may add something to that, I've done research on migration, global migration for many years. And I mean, the hardest thing to forecast and to factor into modeling is tipping points, right? And we have learned this in the climate change, global environmental change context as well. And so taking the example of this huge wave coming into, I mean, my wife and I, we were in Munich end of August when the first big wave hit. On one day, there was 80,000 people arriving at the main train station in Munich in one day. And we went to the largest refugee camp just north of Munich, and I mean, it's just amazing. Nobody expected that. So these are tipping points that I mean, you are the pro in forecasting, but it's very hard to account for that in a long-term scenario.
Right. Yeah, what we can tend to do in forecasting is identify some of the imbalances that might create some of those tipping points, but we can't really foresee them. It's like the Arab Spring. We knew there were imbalances, but we didn't know it was going to happen next year. Please.
But when you, maybe I misheard you, but when you were talking about that impact of that migration, you were naming things that sort of would be a negative impact, but aren't there also the positive impacts? For example, the aging of the European population and the fact that these migrants are much younger and bringing in families. Doesn't that have potentially a huge
That's a really good point, and obviously partly the issue there is short-term immediate impacts and longer-term impacts as that population begins to become part of the broader society. Now, in Germany, Kreuzberg in Berlin is still Kreuzberg after a lot of decades. It's still heavily Turkish. although it's also become very fashionable. It takes a long time to take a big wave of migrants and bring them into society. It takes almost certainly a generation, and often more than one generation. But you're right, there will be positive impacts in terms of offsetting the baby dearth and other things over the longer time. Libby.
I'm having a hard time framing this question quite the way I'm thinking, but is there a way to factor in the deaths due to conflicts, wars, as well as undeclared war, but killing one's own people in the country?
The question is there a way to factor in conflict-related deaths, I guess, within and across borders? In the WHO categories of mortality and morbidity, this accidents and injuries category actually is where they place conflict-related deaths. So they are accounted for. I mean, demographic systems are remarkably good accounting systems. We can count people pretty well. Only fairly recently we had the richness of the typology that we have now to place people in, and it's still in many parts of the world they don't get in the right category. They die of one thing and they're put in the wrong category in the death certificate. But there is a fairly significant accounting of conflict-related deaths. One of the amazing things to me is that the 20th century went from a population of something like 1.6 billion people in 1900 to over 6 billion people in the year 2000. And that was the century of World Wars I and II, and tens of millions of people either directly or indirectly killed in those two wars. But we had that kind of a population increase. So we know they should be counted, we know they should be in there, but historically they haven't been dramatically changing the demographic patterns. Other questions or comments at this point? Yes, please.
I have a question about where low income, kind of, you were saying that extreme poverty is about $2 a day or the absolute $2.25. What are kind of the factors for some of the other incomes?
So the factors for the other incomes?
So what is the range for low income? What is the range for middle class? What is the range for upper class?
Oh, okay. The question is around how are the categories identified basically for different categories of income. At the country level, the average GDP per capita, that typology is that I'm using here is maintained by the World Bank. And every year they go through and they reclassify countries. And I should know, but I don't know what those stepping stones are from that low income to the lower middle. At one time I knew, but those numbers have escaped me. But they're on the web. A different part, I mean, in a way, your question's got two parts. One is across countries, and another one is within countries, low income, middle income, and so on. This middle income, $10 to $50 a day that I put up there is reasonably widely used, but there are tremendous variations on it. And I constantly see numbers in the newspaper or other media that say we have now 2 billion middle-class people in the world or whatever, without any definition of what that is at all. No explanation of how they got there. At least in our modeling system, we put in a range. We could have put in $10 to $100 a day and calculated from the distributional curves of population income we have across population. We could have calculated the middle class, however we define it, and we always try to identify it. But you'll find classifications all over the board. Yeah, Alana.
Yeah, I have a question about when we're looking at the domestic inequality, the highest level of inequality was in, I believe, high middle-income countries, and the lowest level was in low-middle-income countries, with then high income and low income in the middle. So I was wondering, could
We looking at this graphic or?
Yeah, so lower and middle income countries have the lowest energy quality, and upper middle income have the highest.
Okay. There used to be something that was fairly widely accepted called the Kuznets curve of inequality. And the argument around the Kuznets curve was that the lowest income levels in a country, at very low income levels, more or less everybody's poor. Obviously, you've got a few potentates who have money, palaces and so on, but most people are poor. So the Gini index tends to be fairly low. As you begin to develop economically, you develop a richer agricultural class, then an industrial class, and those people get richer while the people at the bottom don't necessarily. And so income disparities grow at that middle. And then as you get to be richer societies, some of those disparities, some of that begins to spread, trickle down or whatever you want to call it. But also you have a lot of redistribution in the richer societies. One of the reasons that income distributions after taxes and distributions are much lower in high-income countries is because of redistribution through tax and expenditure systems. So the argument has been that the lowest income countries have fairly egalitarian systems. The high-income countries have somewhat more, and in between you have less. Now that isn't exactly displayed up here, but that upper middle income category you're looking at there is heavily influenced by China, for one thing, and by the growth of inequality in China, the slope of that red line. And it's consistent with that Kuznets curve hypothesis. And I say it used to be because there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of argument that shows longitudinally across time within societies that it doesn't hold up very well. Cross-sectionally, you look around the world, it seems to hold up fairly well. But longitudinally over time within countries, it hasn't proven quite as robust an explanation. Other. I think I should then give people a chance who want to and need to, we won't ask you which it is, who want to or need to go about other business. But I am prepared to stay here and show you a few more graphics or to talk with you as long as the dean doesn't kick me out. So please, anybody who needs to do that, please do. Mike, thank you.
So I actually want to go back to Renee's question about, or comment about the tremendous migration that's going on into the countries of Europe from the Middle East.
Yeah.
And I think we've seen an example of that as what's happening in France. The other concern that they have is that there's a fairly significant portion of these migrants who are young men. Right?
Yes.
I think the larger portion of them are
Right.
probably more young men than there are women and families.
Right.
But and the whole thing about sort of that happens, that sort of at least the thing that happened in France, that many times as you're leaving a country that's in such turmoil, you have such high expectations of the place where you're going.
Yes.
And then if those expectations are not met, some of the concerns about sort of this radicalization that could happen of the young men as part of that process that then influences the whole sort of integration or acculturation or people moving into those countries. And I don't know if that'll happen in Germany, but France has always felt is that, and France, is also, has raised to be one of the sort of what I call mean-spirited countries around sort of immigration and that moving in. And Germany has not yet, but that is one of the possible outcomes that could happen from that type of situation.
Yeah.
That seems to be what people are concerned about from a social perspective.
Oh, absolutely. I haven't seen statistics on the gender and age breakdown of the migrants. Most of the pictures we see in the media have families, a lot of young children, and I know that those pictures are in the media in part because they have media appeal. But I've suspected something along the lines of what you're suggesting, that underneath those pictures, the larger all these arrivals in Munich in that one day. Do you have any idea what the gender breakdown was and how many of those were single males as opposed to families?
That's a good point, yeah. Significant overrepresentation of the single male group. Basically in the late 20s.
Yeah, that's what I would have suspected, and that's, I think, your hypothesis as well. I haven't seen any data on it.
No.
Please.
I have one more before we get into the environment, but it's back to health outcomes, and I'm wondering about the sort of the higher income. I mean, some of the stuff that I've looked at sort of indicates that the more income, the more stress, the more work, you know, sort of the more chronic disease. Is there any indicators that you look at that are, or are there any indicators that you look at that sort of correlate whether or not income translates to health?
It's a good question. If we go back to this deaths by group, in that chronic disease category is mental health related mortality. And when we wrote a volume, which if you're interested in health, you might be interested in our volume. It's on our website. I can give you a hard copy too. It's called Improving Global Health. And we were looking at forecasts of health. We used these 3 general categories, but we actually broke these 3 categories down into 13 subcategories. We took some of the major causes of mortality and morbidity out of them and looked at them separately and then rolled them up. And one of them was mental health. Now, almost all of the other categories, the forecasting formulations made them highly responsive to increasing education or income, reductions in mortality. Mental health does not. But that doesn't mean it goes the other direction.
Yeah.
The formulations we built basically have a more or less constant percentage. Now, it was one of the more difficult things we tried to deal with. I'm not really happy with our treatment, but we couldn't find that other relationship that corresponds to the other causes of death.
Yeah, it just kind of like reminds me of the blue zones or the happiness projects, you know, places where they've looked at longevity, and it's just often very simple lifestyles that, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, interrupt me at any time, but I'll take a couple minutes to move on here into that third category. This is a graphic related to technological change. This is the percentage of populations. Actually, it's the number of ICT mobile broadband connections per 100 population. Same 4 income categories. And you'll see that it goes above 100 because many of us have multiple. I think in my presence here, I've got 3 right here in this room. And many of you have 3, 4, 5, who knows how many. But we capped it at 140 for our forecasts. And the striking thing here is how dramatically compressed this expansion of ICT mobile broadband is. It's all happening within a period from almost nothing to full penetration within a period of about 30 years. The waves of ICT technology, this is another thing we're trying to deal with in our forecasting. We know we had a wave around personal computers, and there was a lot of argument about how much impact there was of those personal computers on productivity, economic productivity. It seems to have lagged behind. David sitting over here has done a lot of work on this area. Another wave certainly is around things like ICT broadband. There'll be additional waves, and that takes me to the next graphic. This comes from a consulting group a bit bigger than the Pardee Center called McKinsey Global Institute. And they have done a study of what they refer to as the major disruptive technologies. And I think they identified either 10 or a dozen of them. These are just the top 5. And these top 5 disruptive technologies were ranked based upon how big an economic impact McKinsey estimated they would have between now and the year 2025. How much contribution to productivity and economic growth. And you can see that the one at the very top there, the mobile broadband or internet, they're estimating someplace between 3.7 and 10.8 trillion dollars. To put that in some context, what is the U.S. economy now? I should know this number. Help me out, anybody? I'm going to say 8 trillion. I think it's bigger than that, though. I think maybe it's 18. I think I'm getting it. I lost the decimal place there. I think it's 18 trillion. So this would be up to about as much as half of the U.S. economy size. And going down, the technologies that we're going to be hit with in the next waves, the automation of knowledge work, my comment about changing patterns of education, and perhaps even the disruption of these categories like secondary and tertiary, the Internet of Things. When all of our houses, including obviously not just our thermostats, but just basically everything in them and that we're carrying around is connected. Cloud technology. Most of us are actually already using cloud technology. We've got Dropbox. We've got all kinds of things that take us out there. Advanced robotics. Shortly below this, only below because it's 2025 they're looking at, is artificial intelligence in its various forms. And these are huge disruptive technologies which have tremendous economic growth potential. They also contribute heavily to what is called consumer surplus. That is to say, it's not measured in GDP, but we are getting more and more benefit. We're spending less and less money. Every year the costs of these things come down, and we're getting more and more connectivity and richness and streaming. But at the same time that we have the productivity benefit and the benefit for consumers, we know that they are disrupting labor forces. We know that they're disrupting societies in very significant ways. One of the things that I would wish I understood better was the degree to which those technologies might help us in something we need to do, and that is to make a transition in our energy systems from fossil fuels primarily to other energy forms, particularly the new renewables, various forms of solar, wind, geothermal, and so on. This graphic shows historically the levels of coal, gas, and oil, hydroelectric, nuclear, and renewables. And then after 2015 shows the forecast that we're working with right now, which would suggest that the new renewables, which are much less carbon emitting, more in the creation of the materials like the turbines and the photovoltaic cells, not in their use, not in their operation. Those technologies could, we think, by 2040 be providing more energy than coal, gas, or oil individually. We have been criticized for a number of years at the optimism of that forecast. But what I've been surprised by is over the last 5 years, we get less and less criticism. More and more people are suggesting that some of these technologies, and it's not just the internet and computing and artificial intelligence and technologies, obviously it's also batteries and storage systems, are going to begin to make that possible, along with the reduction in costs. So the disruptive technologies may, in fact, make it possible to make that transition. Let me say, that transition, that optimism there, in terms of new renewables, feeds forward in our forecasting system to our carbon emissions. And that's the last graphic I'm going to show you. These are 4 scenarios of global, they're not carbon emissions, they're atmospheric concentrations, so the atmospheric stock of carbon, which in pre-industrial period was about 290 parts per million. Now it's over 400 parts per million. And these 4 scenarios that we did for an earlier project with the United Nations Environment Program, Global Environment Outlook number 4, these 4 scenarios frame what we were able to get our model to do. And the forecast I just showed you, with the renewables coming up by 2040 to pass the other 3, still leave us near the top lines of this graphic. That is to say, we're still up around 600 parts per million by the end of the century, which is way above the 450, which is going to be talked about again in Paris here in December, and is the target that many people are trying to suggest we have to maintain. So we've got a combination of these disruptive technologies, dramatic, positive, lots of good things going on, and at the same time, a sustainability issue which isn't going to be addressed just by those technologies. It's going to require lots of other action and intervention. Concluding comments. Trying to wrap up. I am very positive. Actually, you've heard me now for an hour and 20 minutes. You know that I'm a pretty positive guy, a pretty optimistic guy. On human development, I am very positive. I think that the trends in terms of education advance, a movement towards more gender equality, slow as it is, health improvement, poverty reduction, these are tremendous advances, and we have lots of reasons to believe that they're going to continue. The social change transformations are mostly positive, but I think more mixed. Domestic inequalities in income, in wealth, in gender are big challenges, even though we've got this great progress going on with respect to global inequalities and reducing those. And then we've got this thing pending here, this power transition globally, China coming up on the United States, and in a period when it still may not be democratically stable. In fact, almost certainly won't be democratically stable by 2030. So that's a concern. Technological changes, obviously, we know are going to be super dramatic. Almost all the forecasts that we make near the beginning of this century are going to be wrong at the end of the century, in large part because of technological changes that we can't anticipate. And the environmental challenges, in spite of those technological changes, are obviously going to be daunting. I haven't mentioned water issues, but in some ways I'm actually more concerned about water in the next 20 years than I am about the impact of warming in the longer term.